May 9th, 1945. Europe exhaled, but the forests of Bavaria still held smoke, curling over twisted rail lines and hollowed villages. Liberation did not arrive like a parade. It crept quietly, in the slow unsealing of places where humans have been stored like shadows. At Stalag V, a worn German army compound turned prison, the Americans swung open the gates expecting the familiar, gaunt men, hollow-eyed, skeletal. Instead, they found women, rows upon rows of them, shoulders squared as if habits still mattered, eyes hollow but unflinching. Couriers, resistance fighters, civilians swept into the Nazi machinery. Official records had scarcely acknowledged them, yet here they stood, skeletal, ragged, unbroken. The first moments were taut with instinctive dread. The women had learned to read every gesture of authority. The scrape of boots, the tilt of a hand on a rifle, the shadow of a gaze. A single raised voice could mark the end of someone they knew. When the Americans approached, many braced for mockery, intrusion, or worse. But what happened instead was quiet, procedural, almost disarming. Soldiers moved in teams, one securing the perimeter, another checking rations, medics standing by with stethoscopes. Names and ranks were called. Hands stayed at their sides. Eyes were not violated. Bodies were not handled without consent. It was not kindness. It was restraint, and in that restraint lay a seed far more dangerous than cruelty, the possibility of healing. One survivor later recalled in her journal, "It wasn't the blankets or the food or even the clothes. It was that they didn't touch us, that they let our bodies belong to ourselves again." By evening, Stalag V's gates had shifted from an ending to a threshold. Women were loaded onto waiting trucks, not cattle cars. Their destination was a processing depot, a place between captivity and freedom, where survival might no longer be the only task. And as the engines rumbled and spring rain fell in sheets over Bavaria, one question hung in the air. What becomes of a woman who has survived the unimaginable when survival alone is no longer required? The convoy rolled toward Camp Ashford, a temporary depot where the rules of freedom would be measured in small, almost invisible gestures. The trucks rattled along muddy Bavarian roads, carrying the women away from Stalag V into a landscape that still smelled of diesel, wet earth, and more shadow. Villages lay flat, forests whispered memory, and every bump in the road reminded bodies long starved to touch just how fragile they had become. Freedom did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, like the soft scraping of wheels against gravel, always waiting to see if trust would return. Camp Ashford waited, Camp Ashford was a liminal space, a waiting room between captivity and what might come next. Snow fell softly, coating the yard and the tents. Women buttoned coats stenciled with their initials. Ownership stitched quietly into wool. And in that ownership, in that tiny assertion of self, a spark of something resembling hope flickered. For the first time in years, survival was not the only horizon. Slowly, the women began to ask themselves, was this temporary or the outline of a new normal, fragile and human in its quiet insistence? Winter tightened its hold over Bavaria, and in the compound at Regensburg, the survivors would begin to discover what it meant to participate in life, not merely endure it. Winter crept into Bavaria like a quiet ghost, seeping into the forests, curling along railway lines, and pressing frost into the corners of the Regensburg compound. The war was over, but those inside lived in a state of suspension. They were no longer prisoners, but not yet citizens. They existed in a liminal space between survival and life. At first glance, the compound seemed ordinary. Rows of barracks, clerical tents, mess lines. But each corridor carried an unfamiliar weight. The possibility of routine, of purpose, of being seen. Zofia, once clutching a spoon like a weapon, now sat at a desk translating birth certificates for displaced mothers. Elise, once a courier darting through Nazi checkpoints, moved confidently between the Polish delegation and the Americans, bridging worlds of paper, language, and trust. Even the girl from Minsk, who had once hidden in her bunk with tears, now oversaw the laundry detail, her hands steady, her nights unbroken by sobs. Small roles, perhaps, but roles nonetheless, a lifeline threaded from recognition. And slowly, a fragile rhythm returned. The clatter of typewriters replaced the crack of rifle butts. The smell of boiled cabbage in the mess hall replaced the acrid stench of ash and smoke. Laughter, awkward, hesitant, almost disbelieving, slipped through the halls, a sound both foreign and familiar. One afternoon, when Elise teased Zofia about her accent, the laugh that followed startled them both. Real, belonging to them. Then came the tribunals. Not the grand trials that would fill newspapers in years to come, but preliminary interviews, gathering testimony from those who had endured the machinery of cruelty. In shuttered corners of old German officers' club, survivors sat at wooden tables, voices low, ashtrays brimming, coffee bitter and hotel. A Belgian resistance fighter spoke of blows delivered in a factory near Dortmund. A Czech nurse recounted assaults in a Hamburg barracks, her voice trembled. Zofia sat at the center of it all, translating every word with precision, her tone steady, her hands unwavering. She did not soften the edges. She did not flinch. As the Rumors spread fast. Soviet officers had arrived to collect their people. For the survivors, the words carried the weight of old nightmares. Forced repatriation meant not homecoming, but suspicion, interrogation, and sometimes punishment. Many had already fled Soviet transport stations, skeletal and terrified, choosing hunger on endless roads over returning to hands that sought to claim them once more. The meeting took place in a stark administrative room, windows taped from the war, sunlight pale against the concrete walls. Soviet officers stood rigid in wool coats, their voices sharp, demands clear. Opposite them, American commanders listened, faces unreadable. Outside the door, survivors pressed close, every sound magnified. The scrape of chairs, the click of boots, the rise and fall of foreign tongues. This was not mere paperwork. It was a contest between politics and personhood, between authority and the right to choose. And then, the Americans said no. Not without consent. Each woman would decide her own fate. For those who had spent years under regimes where choice was an illusion, the refusal felt revolutionary. A boundary had been drawn, and it was in their favor. Power was no longer possession. It could be permission. Inside the compound, life adjusted to this fragile victory. New women arrived nearly every day, some carrying infants, others empty-handed, their bodies fragile, eyes haunted. Zofia often greeted them first, her voice low, guiding them through forms, showing them where to find warmth, food, water, a bed that did not reek of rot. Each small gesture became a lifeline, each instruction a tether to survival. Children began appearing as well, trailing behind mothers whose smiles had been long forgotten. The yard, once echoing with the rigid commands of drill, now reverberated with tentative laughter, the scratch of chalk on borrowed slates. Women took turns teaching letters, prayers, songs, small acts of reconstruction. Survival had transformed into something larger, a fledgling community stitched together from shared wounds and careful care. Yet the fear remained. The Soviets could return, pressing claims, demanding bodies as proof of allegiance. But with each refusal, each coat stenciled with initials, each signature taken without coercion, a radical truth settled. Dignity could now be defended. This was not triumph, not certainty, but a lesson more profound than any military victory. Power, when wielded differently, could protect rather than destroy. For the women of Regensburg, it was a revelation as potent as any weapon. As spring melted the snow from Bavarian fields, the compound itself transformed. Barracks became transitional housing. Mess tents became cafeterias. Guards were replaced by clerks and case officers. And the pressing question returned, sharper than ever. If survival was no longer the only task, what came next?